just to begin, I'd like to acknowledge country, but I'm actually going to use a different acknowledgement of country that I came across recently because I just think it's a really lovely acknowledgement of country that is, yeah, you'll understand when I read it. And just to acknowledge that it's from the Closing the Gap Annual Compilation Report 2026. So I had a look at the report recently, trying to see if there had been any improvements in some of the Closing the Gap targets, particularly around child protection. And in reading the report, I came across this, and anyway, it's from the Closing the Gap Annual Compilation Report 2026. So for over 65,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have sustained thriving, diverse and interconnected economies built on systems and knowledge grounded in deep relationships with country, kin and community. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australia's first researchers, innovators, traders and knowledge holders, and honour their expertise and experience built through an enduring connection to and custodianship of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands, sea, and waters where we live, work, and gather. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present. So thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Kira Smith. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Social Policy Research Centre. And today I'm delighted to introduce Deborah Lupton's Living Futures book talk. So Deborah Lupton is a Sharp Professor in the Centre for Social Research in Health and the Social Policy Research Centre in the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture at UNSW Sydney. She leads the Vitalities Lab and the UNSW node of the AOC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. So Deborah will speak for about 40 minutes and that will be followed by a Q&A. So just please stay muted to help with the audio quality. Post captions in the chat anytime, or you can wait for the Q&A to ask directly. And auto captions are available via the CC button at the bottom of your screen. So thank you. I'll pass over to Deborah now.
Thanks, Kira. So yes, Living Futures, this book came out yesterday. So I'm in a great state of excitement about this book. This is my authored book or co-authored book number 21. And it actually, out of all the 21 books I've written so far, it was the most fun and most interesting to write, I have to say. I just loved really getting down in the weeds with how people engage with futures thinking and how they think about and talk about their futures. Oh, hang on. So, Living Futures, the title, just to explain the title, Living Futures, and how I define that phenomenon in the book. So this is a quote from the book, and what I say in the introduction when I'm explaining the title is that futures are lively, living and lived, full of effective forces that propel us to imagine, reflect on, or seek guidance or clarity on what lies ahead in our own destinies. Living futures can also be interpreted as a hopeful way of thinking about the future in which human life and that of the ecosystems of which they are part are sustained and flourishing. Also from the introduction to the book and just explaining what I try to do throughout the book, I build on recent social and creative inquiry to argue for the reintroduction into futures thinking of approaches that recognise the importance of religious and mystical worldviews, creativity and speculative imagination. In adopting these perspectives, I aim to push the boundaries of futuring inquiry by making connections between historical eras, cultures and disciplines, and seeing how these connections might generate interesting modes of conceptualising futures and futures thinking. So I've got just the contents there. It's a short book because it's part of the Routledge shortcut series, which subtitled Introduction to Big Ideas. So they're meant to be short, pithy, interesting, accessible books. So it's about 50,000 words long. We're not allowed actually to write more than that. That's the limit. And so there's 5 substantial chapters, the introduction, where I bring in explanations of the different theories and concepts that I'm working with throughout the book. Then the next chapter is on histories and futures, where I talk about how people have engaged in futures thinking, including fortune telling, divination, prophesizing, prognostication, whatever the term is that we use for futures thinking across eras. I talk about how people have done that, how societies and cultures have done that basically since ancient times, right up to the present day. Then the next chapter is anthropologies and futures because there's a lot of very, very interesting anthropological investigations and inquiries into how people in different cultural contexts, contemporary or near contemporary cultural contexts across the world, engage in futures thinking and practices of divination and fortune telling. So I was able to really get interested in exploring. Basically, in every continent is included in this book, even Antarctica. Um, and uh, so that for me, that was super interesting to see how across cultures people are engaging in futures thinking. Then four gets me on to sort of, I guess, more familiar territory as someone trained in sociology, looking at sociologies and geographies of futures. I included geographies in there because cultural and social geography, I've always really enjoyed reading social and cultural geography, even published in a few of their journals. And what, of course, cultural geographers bring into the discussion of futures is the socio-spatialities, place and space, and how they influence how people think about futures. And then the fifth substantive chapter, creative futuring, is where I get to talk about outspace methods, design, practice, and speculative design. There's also some discussion there of speculative pedagogies from the discipline of education. I also talk about museumology and curation and how exhibitions in museums have over time presented ideas about the future. There's actually museums devoted to presenting exhibitions about the future, for example. There's also interesting museum exhibitions these days that try to sort of critique how the future has been represented in very sort of Western ways. So there's lots of interesting things to talk about in that chapter. And then in the quite brief conclusion, what I do is I bring all these insights together that I've developed across these different disciplines, across the different chapters, across the different historical eras, and sort of engage in a bit of a few provocations where I talk about, well, what is it when we're building on all these insights that I've developed throughout the book? How can we begin to engage as researchers in futures thinking approaches that are creative, that are fresh, that get beyond the standard sort of forecasting and quantitative modeling that tends to dominate futures thinking these days, at least in the commercial field. And I talk about potential methods. So I'm actually this is how I'm going to finish the talk today. Actually, I'm going to talk about those provocations and the methods that I've suggested in the conclusion. So, something that I really enjoyed talking about throughout the book is the materialities of future thinking. And when looking across areas and across cultures, discerning the different things and objects that people have actually used to engage in lay practices of future thinking. So there's discussion in the book of how rocks are used, plants, animal intestines and bones. When we think about the ways that the ancient cultures, for example, used to cut open animals like sheep and goats to read the future using their intestines. Glaciers, birds, hallucinogenic substances, celestial bodies, crystal balls, dice, charms, spells, cards, or, of course, in recent times, fortune telling and divination have become digitized. So there's quite a few digital technologies such as websites, chatbots, and apps these days where people can use those digital media and digital platforms to engage in futures thinking and fortune telling. So this is actually one example, very popular example. This picture on the right is a screenshot from an app called Carve. Tarot Angel Horoscope. This person who's developed this app does a lot of things in this app. But as you can see, it has 10 million downloads. Very, very popular. It's got very high reviews, 4.5, and it's got over 1 million reviews. So there's a lot of people engaging with this app, enjoying it, commenting on it, rating it highly. So that's one example of how fortune telling and divination have become digitized in recent times. So another quote from the book is sort of how I explain what I understand by futuring. So what I say is that futuring is a way of knowing and being for meeting the desire for uncertainty in uncertain times, managing risk, assisting with decision making, peering into the unknown, allowing people to express their anxieties and fears, and helping them clarifying their thoughts and feelings about life. Everyday futuring practices are often pragmatic ways that people make sense of the world in which they live, ascribe moral meanings to their past experiences and to futures, or contemplate their relationships with other humans and with other than human beings in ways that could go beyond quotidian experience. So basically, futuring practices engaged in by people in their everyday lives can be just part of quite mundane practices that they engage in quite routinely, but in some occasions, and especially in over some historical eras, they've actually taken on far more imports, far more significance. They've been in ways that people engage with the spiritual, with other worlds, with the dead. Um, so there's an interesting combination. I think even today, across cultures today, there's an interesting combination of these more sort of mundane ways of futuring, the sort of more extraordinary ways of futuring that people are still very interested in engaging with. So in the book, I talk about concepts to future think with, and these are more than human temporal entanglements and affective forces and embodied materialities. I've talked a little bit about that already. One really key topic that I discuss in the book, which really underpins a lot of the analysis in the book and discussion in the book, is chronodiversity. That is, the different ways across historical periods and across cultures that time is understood. Because I think without really understanding about these differences and diversities and changes and transformations in the way that people in different parts of the world in different eras have understood time, including in Western cultures, of which I am a member, we can't really understand the concept of futures unless we really can understand better how people understand time. So I look at the time and space dynamic. I look at how time and space are viewed as contingent, relational, and non-linear. I look at imaginaries and speculative fabulations. That's where I get to bring in, of course, talking about speculative fiction, speculative design, speculative art making, science fiction, and so on. I also talk about counter queer and radical futurisms and decolonizing futures and futurelessness because again, as a sociologist, I'm always interested in the social differences between social groups, inequalities, the ways that some people are left out of futuring or not considered, or their futures aren't considered important, or they might feel as if they don't have a future, which is where futurelessness comes into the picture for those people who are marginalized and disadvantaged. But this is where counterqueer and radical futurisms comes in because those types of futurisms are very cognizant of these social inequalities and social justice issues around futures. And this is where activists, researchers, those who actually want to have an active say and give marginalised communities an active say are really making a huge difference in terms of different ways of thinking about the future and different ways of engaging people themselves in contributing to futures thinking. There's discussion of atmospheres, hauntology, and spooky and weird futuring, drawing on the really great and interesting work across cultural geography and sociology on affective atmospheres, for example. Hauntology, of course, Derrida's interpretation of hauntology, building on Marx's discussions of the spectre that is haunting Europe. Very much a radical analysis, of course, from Marx about social disadvantage and inequalities, taken up by Derrida in his work, taken up by the cultural theorist Mark Fisher, and actually getting quite a lot of interest across the social sciences and humanities now, this concept of hauntology, or basically how the spirits or the ghosts of the past continue to inhabit the future, and or the present and the future across different time scales, and what that means for how we understand futures. And spooky and weird futuring is really interesting too. I guess it's a way of querying futures to look at what we can learn from how to imagine futures otherwise through that sort of more weird or spooky lens. Also, I'm interested in deep time, palimpsestic time. Now, the word palimpsest comes from originally from a very material thing. It was from historical manuscripts that in the days when writing happened on very expensive forms of animal skins or papyrus, that basically these materials were never wasted. Then if people wanted to write over those manuscripts, they would basically scratch out the words or the images and write or draw or illustrate over those. But what the palimpsest is, you can actually often see the remains of those previous writings or illustrations. And so there's been some theorists talking about how we can understand time in that way, that whenever we move around our everyday lives or look at archaeological sites, for example, we can discern the past in the present, but also that helps us think about the future as well. Far future worlds, again, going sort of the opposite of deep time in some way, but continuous with deep time. So we talk about deep time as going back to sort of, millennia, geological ages. Far future worlds is thinking about the future, not just about the near present or even centuries hence, but millennia hence, and how that can help us understand the best way to think about the futures, particularly in relation of the world, particularly in relation to environmental futures, for example, and the ecosystems that we live and share the planet with, and the continuous now as well, which is this very diverse way of thinking again about how the circular nature of time and how we always are existing in both the past, the present, and the future at the same time. Then there's the concept of occult economies and magical capitalism, which has been developed mostly by anthropologists and including in non-Western contexts, but also in Western contexts. So occult economies talks about how people basically make money from engaging in the occult, from offering their services as diviners, as fortune tellers, but also to some extent how people use the occult to improve or enhance their own economic position. And then magical capitalism talks about how across the world, but often particularly in the West, even though we like to think of ourselves as sort of rational, non-superstitious, people who don't engage with magic anymore because we're scientific now. If you look at how management consultants or people who sprig their services as basically influencers, telling you how to improve your lives or improve your financial situation and become more productive, and profit from those pronouncements. They are the kinds of people who gave in speculative economies, stockbrokers and so on, hedge funds. You see very much this notion of magical capitalism in the ways that these people talk about how to improve your finances or improve your productivity. And one example is the Talkfest at Davos, where people basically get together, thought leaders, so-called thought leaders come together to really talk about how they engage in, so-called influencing culture or ways to improve the world's productivity, but it's often very much at the level of rhetoric rather than actual uh, proving that they've actually achieved anything. All right, so just getting back to the notion of chronodiversity. So one thing I like to talk about in the book is these concepts that get beyond the contemporary Western notion of linear time. And this non-linear time concept is basically where you understand time as cyclical and dynamic and iterative. So we've seen this notion of time across cultures, across millennia, and including until very recently in Western cultures. So this idea that we understand time through, say, the seasons, our observations of celestial bodies, of how the seasons change, and noting that there's even during the days of that we live in, that we notice changes in the weather, we notice changes in the environment around us, and our bodies respond to that. So in this context, futures are always seen as shared, distributed, and relational between human and more than human agents. They are immanent in the process of becoming in this idea of non-linear time. There's a quote here from Kyle White, who's an Indigenous North American. And Indigenous cultures very much continue to have, in many cases, this sense of cyclical or spiral time. And what he says is it makes sense to consider ourselves as living alongside future and past relatives simultaneously as we walk through life. This idea again of the continuous present. Then there's a quote about quantum time, which is comes from, of course, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, which again sort of challenges the Newtonian concept of time. And Felicity Coleman, who's a feminist materialist thinker, she has talked about quantum feminism. And from one of her articles, there's this quote: through the conception of quantum, we begin to glean that time, as a narration of a continuous flowing thing, is a false narrative. Then Karen Barad, again a feminist materialist, science and technology studies theorist. Their version of this nonlinear time is the concept of space-time mattering. Of course, Karen Barad comes from a tradition. She was initially trained in quantum physics. So she's one of the key thinkers who's brought together quantum physics together with social theory. Karen says humans make time together with other agents in more than human worlds as part of space-time mattering. Then we have the concept of every-when, which is articulated by some Indigenous Australian communities. And there's a really great book talking about every-when. And there's a quote here from the book from McGrath, Troy and Rademacher. Aboriginal Australian practices for knowing, remembering, and reenacting the past find embodiment in the present, blurring the distinctions of linear time and, in some sense, understanding the present as represented in a continuous now. Then again, the continuous now. So all these concepts of time work to queer time, and I think are very influential for those of us who want to think about futures in a different way from the traditional contemporary Western idea of futures. I'm also really interested in fractal and pattern thinking. There's some examples here from artworks, but also from natural phenomena of the fractal. So the fractal is a recursive, never-ending pattern created through the repetition of a simple process. Fractal thinking can be used to find order in complex systems and map how change occurs. And in terms of thinking about futures, and this is related to chaos theory, what happens when one small aspect changes? How does that change the pattern? So I'm now going to talk about a few of the dominant ways of future thinking across millennia that still exist today and still very popular today. So astrology. There are many people these days who still like to read their horoscopes or do use astrology or horoscope apps. Very, very popular. Most people know what their star signs or their zodiac signs are, and most people can tell you what that means in terms of their personality. Um, so astrology has been around since ancient Egypt at least, then moved in the Hellenistic world. There's also a version of Eastern astrology, which has been very popular in China and Japan, for example. And then in medieval period, concepts of the body and of human wealth and well-being were very much related to environmental factors such as the movements of the celestial bodies, including the zodiac. So at the top there, we've got our zodiac man, which, as you can see from a medieval illuminated manuscript showing the man with various signs of the zodiac inscribed within his body, and that's just an example of how people's health and well-being were understood as being related to the celestial bodies. Physicians of the time would often look at people where star signs were, or in terms of when people were born, and also celestial movements at the time to decide the best mode of treatment if there was something wrong with the patient. Then we have augury, very, very common form of prophesizing in the ancient Greek and Roman world. And what is really interesting about augury, which basically means looking at the patterns of birds, is that many of the words we use now in English for fate, divination, or fortune telling stem from the Greek or Latin for birds. That is how important augury was in the ancient world, and how that importance has moved into the English language. So, for example, the word omen comes from the ancient Greek word for eagle. And the eagle was a special bird of the god Zeus, who was the master god, the god who was believed to control all the other gods, as well as controlling humans, the fates of humans, and also for other large high-flying birds of prey. And several English words for good luck, prosperity, guidance, and divination stem from the Roman Latin auspicium, bird, which means bird watching for omens. So we have the words augur, auspicious, and auspices that we all still use today. Fortuna, as of course, the word fortune, fortune telling, fortunate, many words spring from this Latin word. On the left, we have the Greek goddess Fortuna, who was believed to basically make decisions about humans' fates together with the other gods, but she was the one who worked mostly with Zeus to decide on what humans' fates would be. So people in ancient Roman times would often pray to the goddess Fortuna for her to look kindly upon them. Then, still very dominant in the medieval period, in that image below, that shows the goddess Fortuna spinning the wheel of fortune. And it was understood that it was up to, it was basically either your good luck or your bad luck, whether once the wheel was spun, whether you were at the bottom or at the top, and that determined your destiny. And then, of course, we still do talk about the Wheel of Fortune. In fact, it's been a game show on television. But here it's one of the key tarot cards, the Wheel of Fortune, which you can see the very strong resemblance to the medieval concept of the Wheel of Fortune. Other practices of lay futuring across history, we have tasseography, which is reading tea leaves, coffee grounds, or the remains of wine. We have somatomacy, which is reading parts of people's bodies, like palm reading or reading the bumps of their heads to determine their fate or their fortunes or what will happen to them. Worth noting here that the word mancy, that's often with these words, actually comes from the Greek word for divination. Then we have cleromancy, which is casting lots, casting dice. There's an example of very early dice there on the left, or sticks, just basically casting them down and reading people's fortunes based on the pattern in which these objects have rested. Scrying is related to looking in some reflective surface, so that might be a crystal ball as shown in this image, or It could be looking into a still body of water or into a mirror. Those things have been used for scrying and basically seeing what you can see in those reflective surfaces and what that might tell you about your future, or what someone else can tell about your future if you're consulting a fortune teller. Geomancy is looking at signs and ley lines or forces in the earth. And I Ching, as shown there, is one example of geomancy. Necromancy is consulting with the dead, consulting with the spirits of the dead or the ghosts of the dead. And it was believed, or it has been believed for a long time now, that because the dead are up in, well, ideally in the, not in hell, but in whatever the better place is for people to go in the afterlife too. They're closest to the gods and therefore have greater insight into humans on Earth and their fortunes and their futures. Um, it's interesting that necromancy has been around for millennia, but it got quite a revival following World War One in the Edwardian period because many people were, just so traumatized by the terrible deaths. And spiritualism actually became really popular after a long time of not being that popular in the Western world, where people were trying to talk to the dead. And an interesting fact is that Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, the author of Sherlock Holmes, but also a trained physician, he lost his son in World War One, and he became a really full-on advocate for spiritualism. He believed in fairies and spirits, and wrote books about, promoting the importance of engaging with the spiritual world. And finally, cartomancy, another example of a very popular lay futuring practice. So that means reading cards, different kinds of playing card type things, like the one shown at the top right there. And of course, tarot is one example of that. Now, in terms of, I was talking about Western or linear time, which is also referred to as clock or hegemonic time. And one of my favorite writers writing about hegemonic time or clock time is Barbara Adam, who's a sociologist of time. And she's written about how the invention of clock in the 14th century really made a major transformation in the way that global societies and cultures have understood, experienced, and practiced time. And of course, the Industrial Revolution just intensified clock time. And what it did at the same time was it was all part of processes of rationalization and modernization that, spread across the globe. So prior to the invention of the clock, in Western cultures and certainly in non-Western cultures, this is where people did engage in this cyclical understanding of time, of past, present, and future, in terms of festivals, in terms of observing the weather, in terms of observing the tides, the moon, rise and fall, wax and wane. And that's how they understood time. But when the clock came in, that basically imposed this very mechanical, very rationalized viewpoint of time on people and really changed how people thought about and responded to time, including how they thought about and responded to the future. And again, bringing in that very linear approach to time, that time moves forward in a very linear way, which is the current sort of dominant Western concept of time. Now, what I'm also been quite fascinated is looking at what happened in the Renaissance in terms of futuring thinking. Now, the Renaissance was a time when the ancient texts and ancient philosophy, ancient science was basically reinvigorated. People began discovering old manuscripts after a long period where they were basically weren't consulted. People got very interested again in what the so-called pagan ancient people, including in ancient Greece and Rome. So even in a Western context, they were considered pagan because it was pre-Christian times, of course. So for a long time, the ancient world and their incredible sources of knowledge were deemed inappropriate for Western Christians to engage with because they were pagan. But in the Renaissance time, they began to be rediscovered. And what we see in this very vibrant time of thinking and practice around futuring, divination, prophesizing is you're getting the beginnings of early science. in terms of people observing the natural world and humanist thinking about the laws of the natural world, but engaging also with the so-called pagan beliefs of ancient cultures, and with the very fervent spiritual, there was the Protestant Reformation, basically clashing with the Roman Catholicism at this time as well. So there were lots of people asking questions about the appropriate way of practicing Christianity, but we're getting people practicing magic, practicing alchemy, mysticism, and philosophy, all sort of in the same kinds of ways of thinking, ways of practicing. So, for example, John Dee, who was the Elizabeth I's consultant astrologist, the court astrologist, he would come to the court at her bidding and basically perform rituals so that to help advise her, including astrological analyses, to advise her on what actions she should take, important actions to do with her rule of the country. It's interesting to know. So John Dee is up there on the left, portrait of him on the bottom. There he is from a later painting, the court of Elizabeth I. It's interesting that that painting actually had a row of human skulls on the floor that was later painted out, was discovered by painting restorers because it was considered, I guess, to be just a little bit too much on the mysticism uh, side of things and not quite Christian enough. Then we had Cornelius Agrippa, who was the foundation or the inspiration for the play Dr. Faustus. So there's just a print there from Dr. Faustus, the very well-known play about the sort of magus and the person who could engage in magic and divination. Then we had the Hermetic tradition, which has been around for a very, very long time from the ancients onwards, but again became revived in the Edwardian, well, the late Victorian and Edwardian period. So the Hermetic tradition was a combination of Neoplatonic, Pythagorean, and Kabbalistic philosophy, which Dee and others were engaging with. So it combined esoteric beliefs about the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. Um, and humans were represented as microcosms of earthly and heavenly worlds with a capacity and free will to shape their own destinies and even reach divine levels. And in the late Victorian period, there are amongst English privileged people, they put together what's called the English Occult Revival movement. They put together this Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn Society, which had secret meetings and engaged in all sorts of practices and interesting mystical sort of wrote interesting mystical tracts and was actually associated with the Freemason movement as well. And that was from that movement that the famous Rider Waite tarot cards, which an example of which is there, which you can see very, very strongly related to the original, that medieval engraving of the magus or the magician. All right, so now I'm getting on to the concluding provocations. So this is where I bring together all the things I've thought about in writing the book in my conclusion, and I have some provocations that I pose there. So my provocations: how to disrupt and think beyond or queer mainstream Western notions of the linearity of time. Where do the past, present, and future begin and end? Where are these boundaries blurred? How do we live and walk alongside the past and the future? How do interactions, that's the Baradian term, interactions with things, place, and space generate temporalities? How do people seek to trick time? What time spaces do they share with others, human and non-human? More provocations. How do sensory and embodied experiences of socio-materialities contribute to how people imagine futures? What will the smells, tastes, sights, feelings, and sounds of the future be? How do we imagine futures as part of multi-species worlds located in diverse physical environments and geographical regions? How do we demonstrate kinship and care with all living things and the natural world in our approach to future thinking? Crucial these days, of course, when we look at just the terrible devastation the planet's going through right now. What assemblages of objects, creatures, practices, and humans generate enchantment that help us look forward and motivate us to act on these visions? What are the sites where these interactions are particularly potent, opening up capacities for action and for human and more than human flourishing? Finally, even this is my final slide with even more provocations, and then I'll get on to some ideas. How might we revive the magical imagination? How, as researchers, can we think with augury, scrying, necromancy, geomancy, or astrology? What are the contemporary omens and portents from the natural world we might use to divine our futures? What places, spaces, and things generate atmospheres of futures? What haunts us into and about the future? What are the ghosts of futures past? How do feelings of spookiness, the uncanny, or weirdness provoke us to think otherwise about futures? Where are other living beings in these hauntings and atmospheres? Suggestions. Now, I'm just saying the illustrations on the next couple of slides are actually mine. I'm very keen on collage at the moment. This is where sort of some of my collage I've made about thinking about future worlds. This is a collage showing how basically digital waste is going to become part of our fabulous ancient forest. Suggestions. So, what's some of the things we could be doing with our research participants or in workshops or with each other as researchers interested in futures? Ask people to take photos of objects or images that represent the ways they conceptualize and experience time, or create a collage that involves layering things and places to represent palimpsestic or deep time. Invite people to respond to a creative writing prompt that invites them to craft an alternative history, counterfactual, or a narrative about the history of the future. Use prompts with research participants such as, if you could design the next 7 wonders of the world, what would they be? Design a fossil of the future. Imagine you are an archaeologist 200 years into the future. What kinds of artifacts would you be uncovering and trying to piece together to get a sense of human life in this day and age? More suggestions. We can engage in weathering, thinking with geology and deep timescapes, or with microbes, composting and fermentation. We can encourage people to use their senses to notice patterns of change in their environments and how these changes make them feel in their bodies: air and water quality, weather, rainfall, seasonal turns, building and infrastructure, for example, the presence or quality of footpaths, roads and buildings. We can help them consider how these embodied multisensory observations attune us to temporalities and how we share these temporalities with companion species. We can encourage them to notice fermenting or decomposing matter, erosion, and synergistic relationships, to consider the dynamic spiral and cyclical dimensions of time. Practices of mapping, photography, journaling, drawing, and creative writing can help people document their observations and make connections between what they see and feel when inhabiting these more than human worlds. And that's another of my collages, imagining a world where basically the fungi and the forests have taken over the digital waste. Finally, even more suggestions. This is where and I've got my collage here that's showing Zodiac Man reinterpreted as microbial man. I'm a bit obsessed with microbes at the moment because that's just one of the projects I'm doing. Anyway, even more suggestions. We could ask participants to make a zine or write a poem or short story about using dice, a crystal ball, feng shui, or astrology to predict an everyday event in their life. We can encourage them to design a grimoire, which is a book of magic, including their own spells, invent amulets or incantations for predicting the future, make an almanac for the year 2050, craft a version of Zodiac Man for the contemporary era, like mine, or invent a new set of tarot cards that build on their ideas of what symbols are most meaningful to help them imagine their futures. Participants and researchers can identify the effective atmospheres and layers of the places in which we dwell and through which we move as we go through our lives. We can think about how these atmospheres contribute to the ways we feel and imagine futures. And finally, last but not least, we can acknowledge that our ancestors' knowledge, customs, and experiences live with us and extend into the present. So that is the end of my talk, and you can see here that if you'd like to order the book, there's you can get a 20% discount with this code, and you can go straight to the Routledge's site with the QR code. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. That was a fascinating presentation, and I can't even imagine how much reading went into distilling all that knowledge into a 50,000 word book, was it?
Yeah.